November 1991. Appalachian Mountains, West Virginia. The rain fell like whispers through the skeletal trees, cold, relentless, turning dirt roads into rivers of rust-colored mud. In the heart of coal country, where the mountains rose like ancient sentinels guarding secrets too dark for daylight, the small town of Hollow Creek existed as little more than a memory of better times. This was a place the modern world had forgotten. No shopping malls, no chain restaurants. Just a single main street with a gas station, a corner store, and Frank's Diner. A greasy spoon where the coffee was always burnt and the conversations always hushed. The nearest hospital was 43 miles away, the nearest police station with more than 2 officers, even farther. In November 1991, as the leaves surrendered to winter and darkness crept earlier each day, Hollow Creek was dying. The coal mines that had sustained 3 generations had closed their mouths forever 5 years prior. Young people fled like water finding cracks in stone. What remained were the stubborn, the trapped, and the forgotten, people who'd rather starve on familiar ground than prosper among strangers. And somewhere in those mountains, something else remained too. Something patient, something hungry. The wind carried the smell of decaying leaves and wet earth. If you listened carefully, really carefully, you might hear the distant creak of metal settling, the groan of rust consuming steel, the sound of something that shouldn't be disturbed being disturbed anyway. Hollow Creek had been prosperous once. Back in the 1950s and 60s, when coal was king and America's factories devoured black gold by the trainload, this town thrived. The population peaked at just over 3,000 souls. There were 2 churches, a movie theater, even a small motel for traveling salesmen and coal company executives. But by 1991, only 700 people remained. The movie theater was now a hollow shell with a collapsed roof. The motel's neon sign, Vacancy, had burned out in 1987 and nobody bothered to fix it because there was never anyone to rent the rooms anyway. The churches still stood, but attendance had dwindled to handfuls of elderly widows and a few desperate believers clinging to faith like drowning men to driftwood. The younger generation that stayed, those in their 20s and 30s who hadn't managed to escape, existed in a strange limbo. They worked odd jobs, fixed trucks, sold scrap metal. Some cooked methamphetamine in trailers deep in the hollers where even the law wouldn't venture. Others simply waited, watching their dreams calcify like the mineral deposits in abandoned mine shafts. The mountains themselves seemed to press in closer with each passing year. Dense forests of oak, maple, and pine climbed steep slopes, creating a labyrinth of shadows and silence. Old logging roads wound through the wilderness like veins in a dying body, overgrown, forgotten, leading to places that no longer existed on any map. And scattered throughout these mountains, rusting in clearings and gullies, were the abandoned vehicles. Hundreds of them. Cars, trucks, vans, relics from decades past, slowly being consumed by nature. Some people dumped them there when they could no longer afford repairs. Others simply walked away from vehicles that had died on these treacherous mountain roads and never returned. Nobody cleaned them up. Nobody cared. The mountains would reclaim them eventually, the way mountains reclaim everything. Deputy Raymond Lowe was 34 years old in November 1991, though the lines around his eyes and the gray threading through his dark hair suggested someone much older. He'd been born in Hollow Creek, watched it prosper and decay, and somehow never found the courage or the opportunity to leave. Ray stood 6 feet tall with a lean, weathered build. His uniform was always pressed, his badge always polished, as if maintaining these small dignities might prevent him from sliding into the same resignation that had consumed most of his neighbors. He had a habit of grinding his jaw when he was thinking, and his right hand constantly drifted to the service revolver on his hip. Not from paranoia, but from the weight of responsibility in a place where backup was a concept, not a reality. He lived alone in a small house on Birch Street, the same house where his mother had died 3 years prior. His father had vanished into the mines during a collapse in 1979. One of 17 men never recovered. Sometimes Ray wondered if staying in Hollow Creek was loyalty or cowardice. Most days, he was too tired to care. Ray worked under Sheriff Daniel Garrett, a 62-year-old man whose belly strained against his belt and whose eyes had the distant, unfocused look of someone who'd stopped seeing years ago. Sheriff Garrett had 3 years until retirement. He spent most of his time at Frank's Diner, drinking coffee and pretending the town wasn't crumbling around him, which meant Ray handled everything that actually required work. Then there was Marcus Webb, 31 years old, 6'4", with shoulders like a linebacker and hands scarred from years of manual labor. Marcus had worked in the mines until they closed, and now he survived doing whatever odd jobs the desperate needed done. He had a reputation for being quiet, intensely private, and unnervingly strong. People hired Marcus when they needed something heavy moved, something difficult fixed, or something unpleasant handled. He lived in a trailer on the eastern edge of town, near the old access road that led deep into the mountain wilderness. Neighbors reported that Marcus kept strange hours. His truck, a rust-eaten Ford F-150 from 1978, could be heard rumbling up and down that access road at odd times. 2 in the morning, 4, just before dawn. When asked what he was doing, Marcus would simply shrug. Checking traps, he'd say, or looking for scrap. Nobody questioned him too closely. In a place like Hollow Creek, everyone had secrets. Prying was considered rude at best, dangerous at worst. And finally, there was Emily Parker, 19 years old, pale as porcelain, with auburn hair that fell past her shoulders, and eyes that always seemed to be searching for something beyond the mountains that imprisoned her. Emily worked the evening shift at the corner store, a cramped little place that smelled of stale cigarettes and disappointment. She had dreams once. College, maybe. Art school. Anything that wasn't Hollow Creek. But her father had died in the mines alongside Ray's father, and her mother had succumbed to cancer 2 years later. Emily stayed because she was caring for her grandmother, a woman of 83 who could barely walk but refused to leave the only home she'd ever known. Emily was quiet, observant. She noticed things. The way certain men looked at her with hunger that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with desperation. The way conversations stopped when she entered rooms. The way some people in town had started disappearing. Not all at once, but slowly, over months and years. Drifters mostly. People nobody would miss. She kept a journal, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom. In it, she documented her observations. The strange patterns, the coincidences that weren't coincidences. She didn't know it yet, but that journal would eventually save her life. It began with a smell. Not the usual mountain smells of pine sap and morning dew, not the familiar sense of wood smoke and wet earth. This was something else, something wrong. On November 7, 1991, a Thursday, Marcus Webb was driving his Ford F-150 down Old Sawmill Road, a barely maintained dirt track that wound through dense forest about 8 miles outside Hollow Creek. He was hauling a load of scrap copper he'd salvaged from an abandoned barn, heading to sell it at the recycling center in the next county over. The rain had stopped an hour before, but the road was still treacherous, a winding ribbon of mud and loose stone. Marcus drove slowly, his truck's worn suspension groaning with each rut and pothole. That's when he smelled it. Faint at first, then stronger. A sickly sweet stench that made his stomach turn and his jaw clench. He'd smelled decay before. Deer carcasses, possums crushed on highways, the occasional livestock that wandered into the woods to die. This was similar but not quite the same. There was something almost chemical about it, underneath the organic rot. Marcus slowed his truck, frowning. The smell was coming from somewhere off the road, deeper in the trees. He almost kept driving. Almost. But curiosity, and perhaps something darker, made him stop. He parked the truck and stepped out into the cold November air. The forest was silent except for the drip of water from branches and the distant cry of a crow. Marcus followed his nose, pushing through wet undergrowth, his boots sinking into soft earth. He found it about 50 yards off the road, in a small clearing surrounded by thick stands of pine. An abandoned van, a Chevrolet, maybe from the early 1980s. White once, now more rust than paint. The windows were dark and clouded. Vines had begun climbing the wheel wells. Leaves covered the hood like a burial shroud. The smell was coming from inside. Marcus approached slowly. Something in his gut told him to leave, to get back in his truck and forget what he'd found. But he didn't. Maybe he was curious. Maybe he was stupid. Maybe some part of him already knew what he'd find and was drawn to it anyway. He reached for the van's rear door handle. It was locked, but the rust had made it weak. One hard yank, and it gave way with a screech of corroded metal. The smell hit him like a physical blow. He stumbled backward, gagging, his eyes watering. Through the tears, he saw shapes inside the van. Dark shapes, irregular, wrong. Marcus Webb had seen death before, but nothing like this, nothing even close. He turned and ran back to his truck, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His hands shook as he fumbled with his keys. He needed to get back to town, needed to tell someone, needed to... But as he reached for his truck's door, he heard something that made his blood freeze. From somewhere deeper in the forest, the sound of another vehicle. An engine. Distant, but growing closer. Coming from a direction where there was no road, no path. Nothing but dense wilderness and forgotten places. Marcus looked back toward the clearing where the van sat. The rear door he'd opened was swinging slowly in the breeze, and standing at the tree line, barely visible in the gathering dusk, was a figure. Watching. Motionless. Too far away to see clearly, but close enough to know it was there. Marcus didn't wait to see more. He threw himself into his truck, gunned the engine, and tore back down Old Sawmill Road, mud spraying behind him, his heart hammering against his ribs like something trying to break free. He drove straight to the sheriff's station, but when he arrived, breathless and pale, Sheriff Garrett just looked at him with tired, skeptical eyes. Another abandoned vehicle. Marcus, there's hundreds of them up in those mountains. Probably just dead animals inside. Maybe a deer crawled in there to die. Sheriff, this wasn't... You been drinking, Marcus? No, sir. Then go home. Get some rest. If there's really something wrong, we'll check it out in the morning. But Sheriff Garrett had no intention of checking anything. He never did. It was Deputy Ray Lowe, overhearing the conversation from his desk in the back room, who finally looked up from his paperwork. He saw something in Marcus Webb's eyes. Something genuine. Something afraid. I'll go up there, Ray said quietly. First light tomorrow. Marcus nodded but said nothing else. He left the station and drove home, his mind replaying what he'd seen. Or thought he'd seen. The shapes in the van. The figure in the trees. The sound of an engine where no engine should be. That night, Marcus didn't sleep. He sat in his trailer with all the lights on and his rifle across his lap, listening to the wind move through the mountains like something searching, like something patient, like something that had been here long before the town existed and would remain long after it was gone. At the corner store, Emily Parker closed up at 10 o'clock, just like she did every night. As she locked the door and walked to her grandmother's house 3 blocks away, she noticed something odd. Marcus Webb's truck, parked outside Frank's diner, still running, headlights on. But Marcus wasn't inside. The driver's side door was open. And in the mud beside the truck, lit by the harsh glow of the streetlight, were footprints, leading away from the vehicle, heading toward the mountains. But there was only one set of prints, no one coming back. Emily stood there for a long moment, staring at those footprints, feeling something cold settle in her chest. She pulled her jacket tighter and hurried home, locking the door behind her. She went straight to her room, pulled out her journal, and began to write. November 7th, 1991. Something's wrong in Hollow Creek. Something's been wrong for a long time. But tonight, I think it finally showed itself. I think it wants us to know it's here. In the mountains above town, the rain began to fall again. And somewhere in the darkness, in a clearing no map would ever show, an abandoned vehicle sat waiting. Its doors locked, its windows dark, its secrets buried in rust and shadow, and the mountains as always remembered everything. Dawn broke over Hollow Creek like a wound opening, red and raw across the eastern sky. Deputy Ray Lowe had been awake since 4 in the morning, drinking burnt coffee in his kitchen, staring at the topographic map of the mountain roads spread across his table, Old Sawmill Road. He'd driven it 100 times, knew every bend and switchback, but Marcus Webb's face kept appearing in his mind, that look of genuine terror. Ray had seen a lot in his years as a deputy. Domestic disputes that turned violent, meth labs exploding in trailers, hunting accidents that weren't quite accidents. But he'd never seen Marcus Webb scared. The man was built like a brick wall and had the emotional range of stone. Whatever he'd found up there had shaken something loose in him, and now Marcus was missing. Ray had driven past Frank's diner at 11 the previous night on his way home. Marcus's truck was still there, engine dead, driver's door open. No sign of the man himself. Ray had radioed it in, walked the perimeter, found those single set of footprints leading toward the tree line. He'd followed them for about 50 yards before they simply stopped, as if Marcus had been lifted straight up into the air. Sheriff Garrett's response had been predictably useless. Man probably went home on foot, needed to clear his head. You know how Marcus is, strange bird. But Ray knew different. Marcus Webb might be strange, but he wasn't stupid. Nobody leaves a truck running with the door open and walks home in the November cold. Not unless something had made them run. Not unless something had made them forget everything else. At 6:30 in the morning, as frost still clung to the grass and breath came out in white clouds, Ray drove his patrol car up the winding mountain road toward Old Sawmill Road. The radio crackled with static. No reception up here. He was alone. The forest pressed in on both sides, dense, dark, ancient. These mountains had stood for millions of years. They'd seen civilizations rise and fall. They'd watched the coal companies rape the earth and then abandon it. They'd witnessed violence and death in forms most people couldn't imagine, and they kept their secrets well. Ray found the spot where Marcus said he'd parked. Tire tracks in the mud, already half washed away by overnight rain. He got out of his car, zipped his jacket against the cold, and adjusted his gun belt. The woods were silent. Not even birds singing, just the drip of water from branches and his own breathing. He followed the path Marcus must have taken, pushing through wet undergrowth, his boots squelching in soft earth. And then, just as Marcus had described, he found the clearing. The white Chevrolet van sat like a monument to decay. Rust had eaten holes through the body. The tires were flat and half buried in dead leaves. Vines wound through the wheel wells and crept up the sides like arteries. The windows were fogged and dark, revealing nothing. Ray approached slowly, every instinct screaming at him to call for backup. But backup was Sheriff Garrett, who wouldn't come. And the state police? They'd laugh at a report about a bad smell in an abandoned vehicle. The rear door was still slightly ajar from where Marcus had yanked it open. Ray pulled a flashlight from his belt, clicked it on, and steeled himself. Then he pulled the door fully open. The smell hit him immediately, that sickly sweet stench of decomposition mixed with something chemical, something wrong. Ray gagged but forced himself to look inside. The van's interior had been completely gutted. No seats except the driver's, no carpet, just bare metal floor. And on that floor, wrapped in stained plastic sheeting and black garbage bags, were shapes, human shapes, bodies, multiple bodies. Ray's flashlight beam played across the scene, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Some of the plastic was torn, revealing flesh in various stages of decay. A hand, bloated and discolored, part of a face, features unrecognizable. Hair, long, dark, matted with fluids. The plastic had condensation on the inside, and things moved within that condensation. Maggots, flies, the busy work of decomposition. Ray stumbled backward, his flashlight falling from his hand. He bent over, hands on his knees, and vomited into the undergrowth. When the heaving stopped, he wiped his mouth with a shaking hand and forced himself to think like a cop instead of a human being who'd just seen hell. How many bodies? At least 3, maybe 4. It was hard to tell where one ended and another began. How long had they been here? Weeks? Months? The varying states of decay suggested different times. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was deliberate, systematic. This was a dumping ground. Ray retrieved his flashlight and forced himself to look again, this time with clinical detachment. He needed details, evidence, something that would help identify the victims or the killer. He scanned the interior, careful not to touch anything. That's when he noticed the scratches. On the inside of the van's walls, barely visible beneath grime and rust, were marks. Deep gouges in the metal. The kind of marks fingernails would make if someone was desperately trying to get out. And near the back corner, almost hidden, were words scratched into the metal. Ray leaned closer, his light illuminating the desperate message, "Help me, can't breathe, God please." The words dissolved into illegible scratches, as if the writer had lost strength, or lost hope. Ray's blood ran cold. These people hadn't been killed somewhere else and dumped here. At least some of them had died inside this van. Trapped, suffocating, clawing at metal that wouldn't give. He backed out of the van and immediately radioed for help. Static. He tried again. Nothing. The mountains swallowed radio signals like they swallowed everything else. He'd have to drive back to town, get the state police involved. This was way beyond anything Hollow Creek could handle. But as Ray turned to head back to his patrol car, something caught his eye. Another set of tire tracks. Fresh ones. Leading away from the clearing, heading deeper into the forest where no road should exist. Someone had been here recently. Maybe last night. Maybe this morning. And then Ray heard it. The same sound Marcus must have heard. An engine. Distant, but growing closer. Coming from somewhere in the dense woods ahead. Ray's hand went to his gun. Every nerve in his body was screaming at him to run, to get back to his car and get the hell out of these mountains. But he was a cop. And somewhere out there, a killer was driving around with God knows what in their vehicle. He started walking toward the sound, following the tire tracks through the trees. The ground sloped downward, getting steeper. The tracks led to what looked like an old logging road, barely more than 2 ruts through the undergrowth, but passable if you knew it was there. The engine sound stopped. Ray froze, listening. Silence. Then faintly, he heard something else. Metal on metal. Like a car door closing, or a trunk opening. He moved forward slowly, quietly, his gun now drawn. Through the trees ahead, he could see a shape. Another vehicle. A truck. Rust-colored Ford F-150. Marcus Webb's truck. But it shouldn't be here. It had been at Frank's diner last night. Doors open, engine dead. How had it gotten up here? Who had driven it? Ray crept closer, using trees for cover. The truck's bed was loaded with something covered by a blue tarp. As Ray watched, someone emerged from the driver's side. But it wasn't Marcus Webb. The figure was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a stained canvas jacket and work gloves. A baseball cap pulled low obscured his face. He moved with purpose, walking around to the truck bed and pulling back the tarp. Beneath it, Ray could see more black garbage bags, more shapes that could only be bodies. The man reached into the truck bed and dragged one of the bags out, letting it fall to the ground with a heavy, wet thud. Then he grabbed it by one end and started dragging it toward the trees, toward somewhere Ray couldn't see. Ray's mind raced. He should announce himself, identify as law enforcement. But he was alone, miles from backup, and this man was clearly comfortable with murder. If Ray revealed himself now, he might not make it back down the mountain. He needed to see where the man was taking the body. needed to understand the scope of what was happening. So Ray followed, keeping low, moving as silently as possible through the wet undergrowth. The man dragged the bag about 100 yards to another clearing, and what Ray saw there made his stomach turn. More vehicles, at least 7 of them. Vans, cars, even an old station wagon, all arranged in a rough circle, like some perverse monument, all rusting, all abandoned. And Ray would bet his life that all of them contained the same thing the white Chevrolet had contained: bodies. This wasn't just a dumping ground. This was a graveyard, a collection. The man was storing his victims like trophies, spread across multiple vehicles hidden throughout the mountains. The man dragged the garbage bag to a dark blue van and opened the rear doors. Even from a distance, Ray could smell the decay. The man hefted the bag inside with practiced ease. He'd done this before many times, then closed the doors and stood there for a moment, looking at his collection. That's when Ray's radio crackled to life. The sound was impossibly loud in the silent forest. Static burst, followed by Sheriff Garrett's gravelly voice. "Ray, you up there? Ray, respond!" The man's head snapped around, looking directly toward where Ray was hiding. For a frozen moment, neither of them moved. Ray could feel the man's eyes on him, even though he couldn't see the face beneath that baseball cap. Then the man reached behind his back and pulled out something that glinted in the pale morning light. A hunting knife. Long blade. Well used. Ray raised his gun. "Sheriff's Department, don't move!" But the man was already moving, not toward Ray, away, running with surprising speed toward his truck. Ray gave chase, crashing through the undergrowth, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Stop! Police!" The man reached the truck, threw himself into the driver's seat, and the engine roared to life. Tires spun in the mud, and the truck lurched forward, bouncing over the rough terrain. Ray fired twice, aiming for the tires, but the truck was already moving too fast. He watched it disappear into the trees, the sound of the engine fading into the distance. Ray ran back to the clearing with the vehicles. He needed to see inside them, needed to count the bodies, needed evidence. He went to the nearest one, a rusted Buick sedan from the 1970s. The trunk was sealed shut, but there was a crowbar lying in the mud nearby. The killer's tools. Ray used it to pry the trunk open. Inside were 3 bodies, all in advanced stages of decay, all wrapped in the same black plastic. And lying on top of them, almost deliberately placed, was a driver's license. Ray picked it up carefully by the edges. The photo showed a young woman, early 20s, dark hair, pretty smile. The name read, Jennifer Hartley. Address in Ohio. License issued in 1988. Ray searched the other vehicles. Each one contained bodies. Each one had a license or ID card placed prominently on top, like the killer wanted them to be identified, like this was part of the ritual. By Ray's count, there were at least 19 bodies spread across the 7 vehicles. 19 people who'd disappeared, probably over years. 19 families who'd never gotten answers. Until now. Ray made his way back to his patrol car, his hands shaking, his mind reeling. He had to get state police up here immediately, had to secure the scene, had to. That's when he saw it, scratched into the dirt beside his patrol car, written in letters 6 inches tall. "I saw you too." Deputy Ray's blood turned to ice. The killer had been here. While Ray was examining the vehicles, the killer had doubled back and left this message, had been standing right here, right beside Ray's car. Could still be watching. Ray got into his car, locked the doors, and drove down the mountain faster than was safe. His radio finally crackled back to life as he descended. "State police," he said into the handset, his voice hoarse. "I need state police. Multiple homicides. I need them now." But even as he made the call, Ray knew the truth. The killer wasn't done. Not by a long shot. This was just the beginning. And somewhere up in those mountains, in that labyrinth of abandoned logging roads and forgotten places, a murderer was watching, waiting, planning his next move. and Ray had looked him in the eye. By noon, Hollow Creek had transformed from a dying town into a crime scene. State police cruisers lined Main Street, more law enforcement in one place than the town had seen in 20 years. The diner was packed with troopers drinking coffee and speaking in low, urgent voices. Sheriff Garrett sat in a corner booth, looking pale and old and useless. Ray had given his statement 3 times. Each time the details felt more surreal. Multiple bodies, hidden vehicles, a killer who moved through the mountains like a ghost. Marcus Webb's truck at the scene, but Marcus himself still missing. The state police had secured the area Ray had found. Forensic teams were driving up the mountain road now, prepared to process what one detective had already called the worst crime scene in West Virginia history. News vans were setting up at the town limits, held back by a newly established perimeter. By tomorrow, Hollow Creek would be famous for all the wrong reasons. But Ray wasn't thinking about fame or news coverage. He was thinking about that message scratched in the dirt. The killer knew who he was, knew what he looked like. And Marcus Webb, who'd found the first van, was missing. The pattern was obvious and terrifying. Emily Parker watched the chaos unfold from behind the counter of the corner store. The store was busier than it had been in months. State troopers buying snacks, locals coming in for gossip, reporters trying to get information from anyone who'd talk. Emily listened to everything, absorbed every detail, and added it to the growing picture in her mind. She'd been compiling that picture for months now. The disappearances. At first, she'd thought she was imagining things. People left Hollow Creek all the time. The young fled to cities. Drifters passed through. Nobody kept track of transients and wanderers. But Emily kept track. She'd started documenting it in her journal 9 months ago, after she'd noticed something strange. A woman had come into the store, early 30s, looked rough, like she'd been living on the margins. She'd bought cigarettes and asked about cheap places to stay. Emily had directed her to the motel. 2 days later, Emily saw that same woman's jacket in Marcus Webb's truck, just lying there in the passenger seat when Marcus came in to buy motor oil. Emily had mentioned it casually. "Hey, that jacket looks like one a customer had." And Marcus had frozen, just for a second. Then he'd smiled and said he found it on the road, but his eyes had been flat, empty. After that, Emily started paying attention. And once she started looking, she couldn't stop seeing. The pattern wasn't obvious. It was subtle, spread over months, hidden in the background noise of a dying town. But it was there. People disappeared. Always people nobody would miss. Hitchhikers, runaways, drug addicts, people passing through with no family, no connections, no one who'd file a missing person report. And always, there were small signs afterward. A piece of clothing seen in someone's vehicle. A backpack sold at the pawn shop 2 towns over. Shoes too nice for the person wearing them. Emily had documented 12 cases over 9 months. 12 people who'd been in Hollow Creek one day and gone the next. 12 people whose belongings had mysteriously appeared in places they shouldn't be. And now, with state police crawling through the mountains finding bodies, Emily realized her suspicions had been horrifyingly correct. She pulled out her journal during her lunch break and flipped through the pages. Names, dates, descriptions. Everything she'd noticed, everything everyone else had missed. She needed to show this to someone, but who? Sheriff Garrett was a joke. Deputy Lowe seemed competent, but he was overwhelmed. The state police? They didn't know the town, didn't know the patterns. Emily made a decision. She'd wait until her shift ended. Then she'd find Deputy Lowe and show him everything. Her journal might be the key to identifying the victims. And maybe, just maybe, it would help them find the killer before anyone else disappeared. But as she returned to the counter, Emily felt eyes on her. She looked up and saw a man standing outside the store window. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a canvas jacket and baseball cap pulled low. He was staring directly at her. Their eyes met for just a moment. Then the man smiled, a cold, empty expression that never reached his eyes, and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of people gathered on Main Street. Emily's hands started shaking. She knew that face. She'd seen it before, around town, always in the background, always watching, always there but never quite noticed. And suddenly, Emily realized something that made her blood freeze. She'd been documenting the disappearances, making lists, paying attention. She knew too much. She'd seen too much. And if the killer had noticed Marcus Webb for finding the first van, then he definitely noticed her. Because the man who'd just been staring at her through the window, that was the same man whose truck she'd seen parked outside her grandmother's house 3 nights ago, at 2 in the morning, just sitting there in the darkness, watching. By 3 in the afternoon, the forensic teams had made their first identifications. The bodies in the vehicles matched missing persons reports from across 5 states: Pennsylvania, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia. The victims ranged from 19 to 53 years old. Most were listed as transients, runaways, or chronic substance users. People the system had already failed. People nobody had looked for very hard. But they'd all passed through Hollow Creek at some point, and they'd all encountered the same person. Detective Sarah Chen from the state police had taken over the investigation. She was 42, sharp-eyed, and had worked homicide for 16 years. She'd seen bad things. But this case was different. This was methodical, organized, the work of someone who'd been perfecting their craft for years. She sat across from Deputy Ray Lowe in a borrowed office at the town hall, spreading crime scene photos across the desk. "Tell me about Marcus Webb," she said. Ray leaned forward, his jaw tight. "Born and raised here. Worked the mines until they closed in '86. Been doing odd jobs since. Lives alone in a trailer on the east side. Quiet guy. Keeps to himself." "Any history of violence?" "Nothing on record. Few bar fights when he was younger, but nothing serious." "What about the victims? Any connection to him?" Ray hesitated. This was where it got complicated. "Marcus does handyman work, moves furniture, hauls junk, picks up scrap metal. If someone needed help with something heavy, they'd call Marcus. So he'd have access to these abandoned vehicles. Everyone has access, Detective. There's hundreds of rusted-out cars and trucks in these mountains. Nobody regulates it. Nobody cleans them up. But Marcus knows where they are. He drives these roads regularly." Ray couldn't argue with that. It was true. Marcus knew the mountains better than anyone. Every forgotten logging road, every hidden clearing. Every place where someone could dump something they didn't want found. "What about his truck?" Chen asked. "You said it was at the scene this morning." "It shouldn't have been there. Last night, around 11, I found it parked outside Frank's diner. Engine off. Driver's door open. Marcus was nowhere around. I followed footprints into the woods, but they just stopped. People don't just vanish, Deputy. I know that, but I'm telling you what I saw." Chen studied the photos again. "Maybe Marcus found more than just the first van. Maybe he found the killer's hideout. And maybe the killer found him." It was the theory Ray had been avoiding. Because if Marcus had been taken by the killer, then Marcus was either dead or dying in some hidden location, suffering the same fate as the 19 people they'd found in those vehicles. "There's something else," Ray said quietly. "After I found the bodies this morning, I chased the suspect. Didn't get a clear look at his face, but he was driving Marcus's truck. And when I got back to my patrol car, there was a message scratched in the dirt. I saw you too, Deputy." Chen's expression darkened. "He's making this personal. That's unusual for this type of killer. Most of them avoid confrontation with law enforcement. They want to stay invisible. Maybe he's getting bolder. Or maybe—" Ray stopped himself. "Maybe what?" "Maybe he wants to be caught. Maybe after all these years, he wants someone to see what he's done." It was a disturbing thought, but not unprecedented. Some serial killers eventually craved recognition for their work. They started taking risks, leaving clues, engaging with investigators. It was a form of narcissism, a need to be acknowledged as the artist of their own horrors. "I need you to make me a list," Chen said. "Everyone in this town who has the physical capability to move bodies, who knows these mountains, and who has no solid alibi for the times these people disappeared." Ray nodded, but he was already thinking about that list. In a town of 700 people where everyone struggled to survive, where cash-only odd jobs were the only economy that still existed, alibis were rare and records were non-existent. The killer could be anyone. Emily's shift ended at 6. The November darkness had already settled over Hollow Creek, like a burial shroud. She walked the 3 blocks to her grandmother's house, constantly looking over her shoulder, her journal clutched tightly against her chest. The man in the baseball cap was nowhere to be seen, but that didn't make her feel safer. It made her feel like prey being watched by something patient, something that would strike when she least expected it. She found her grandmother asleep in her recliner, the television flickering with news coverage of the discovered bodies. Emily locked the front door, checked the back door, closed all the curtains. Then she sat at the kitchen table and opened her journal. 12 cases. 12 people. She documented physical descriptions, dates they were last seen, items of clothing or belongings she'd later spotted around town. She'd even drawn rough timelines, showing the spacing between disappearances. On average, 1 person every 3 weeks. Consistent, methodical. But there was something else she'd noticed. Something she'd written in the margins of her journal, but hadn't fully processed until now. The disappearances clustered around certain dates. Specifically, they increased during periods when Marcus Webb had been seen driving his truck late at night. Emily had noted this almost unconsciously. She often worked late shifts and would see vehicles on the road as she walked home. Marcus's rust-eaten Ford was distinctive, hard to miss. But Emily had also seen other vehicles during those late-night drives. A dark sedan, a white van, different vehicles, but always around the same time Marcus was out. What if Marcus wasn't the killer? What if he was like her, someone who'd noticed something wrong and had been investigating? What if Marcus had gotten too close to the truth? Emily grabbed a pen and started making connections. She drew lines between the dates, the vehicles, the disappearances. A pattern emerged. It wasn't Marcus's truck that correlated most strongly with the disappearances. It was a dark blue van. Late 1970s Dodge. She'd seen it 11 times over the past 9 months. Always late at night. Always driving slowly through town, as if looking for something. Or someone. And she'd seen it 3 nights ago. Parked outside her house at 2 in the morning. The same night she'd seen the man in the baseball cap behind the wheel. Emily's heart was pounding now. She knew too much. She'd seen too much. And the killer knew it. A sound outside made her freeze. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate. Coming up the wooden steps to her front porch. Emily grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer, her hands shaking. The footsteps stopped at the door. A pause. Then a knock. 3 slow, measured knocks. "Emily Parker?" A voice. Male. Unfamiliar. "This is Detective Chen with the State Police. Deputy Lowe said you might have information about the case." Emily approached the door cautiously, keeping the knife behind her back. She peered through the peephole. A woman in a professional jacket, holding up a badge. Behind her, Deputy Lowe stood on the porch, his hand resting on his gun. Emily exhaled and opened the door, keeping the chain lock engaged. "How did you know I have information?" "I didn't," Chen said. "But Deputy Lowe mentioned you work at the corner store. You see everyone who comes through town. I figured you might have noticed things." Emily looked at Ray. His eyes were sincere, concerned. She'd known him her whole life. He'd been kind to her after her parents died. She could trust him. She removed the chain and opened the door fully. "I have a journal," she said. "I've been documenting disappearances for 9 months. I thought I was being paranoid, but I wasn't." Chen's eyes sharpened with interest. "Can I see it?" Emily handed over the journal. Chen flipped through the pages, her expression growing more intense with each entry. "This is excellent work," she said quietly. "Detailed observations, dates, descriptions. This could help us identify victims and establish a timeline." "There's something else," Emily said. "I think I know what vehicle the killer uses. A dark blue van. I've seen it multiple times, always late at night. And I think—" She hesitated. "I think he knows I've been watching. He was outside my store today, just staring at me." Ray stepped forward. "What did he look like?" "Tall, broad shoulders, canvas jacket, baseball cap pulled low. I couldn't see his face clearly, but—" Emily's voice dropped to a whisper. "I've seen him around town before. He's not a stranger. He's someone who lives here." Chen and Ray exchanged glances. "Emily," Chen said carefully, "I need you to pack a bag. You're not safe here. We're going to put you up at a motel in the next county with police protection until we catch this person." "What about my grandmother?" "She'll come with you. I'm not taking any chances. If the killer thinks you can identify him, you're both in danger." As if on cue, the lights in the house flickered. Once, twice, then went out completely. The street outside was also dark. A power outage. They happened sometimes in Hollow Creek, especially during storms. But there was no storm tonight. Just cold, clear darkness. Ray drew his gun. "Get away from the windows," he ordered. Chen pulled out her flashlight and her service weapon. "Emily, where's your grandmother?" "In the living room, in her chair." But when they rushed to the living room, shining their flashlights around, the recliner was empty. The blanket that had been covering Emily's grandmother lay on the floor. The back door, which Emily had locked earlier, stood open. Cold November air poured into the house. And on the kitchen table, placed carefully on top of Emily's journal, was a single playing card, the King of Spades, its face stained with something dark and rust-colored. Blood. Pinned beneath the card was a note, written in block letters. "You watched me, now I'm watching you. The old woman is safe for now. Come find her, come alone." You know where Ray grabbed his radio. "All units, we have a kidnapping in progress." Suspect has taken an elderly woman, approximately 83 years old. But Emily wasn't listening to the radio chatter or the coordination efforts. She was staring at the note, her mind processing the final line. You know where. And horrifyingly, she did know. Because 9 months ago, when she'd first started noticing the disappearances, she'd followed Marcus Webb one night. Followed him up into the mountains on Old Sawmill Road. She'd watched him stop at an abandoned vehicle, look inside, and then drive away, looking shaken. She'd written the location in her journal, a clearing off the main road, surrounded by dense pines, a place where screams wouldn't carry, a place where someone could die slowly, and nobody would ever know. That's where the killer had taken her grandmother, to the place where it had all started, to the white Chevrolet van where the first bodies had been found, and he was waiting for Emily to come. Waiting to add her to his collection. Waiting to complete whatever twisted design he'd been building for years. The game had changed. The killer was no longer hiding. He was inviting them in. And Emily had no choice but to accept the invitation, because the only family she had left was somewhere up in those dark mountains, trapped with a monster who'd been killing for years. And time was running out.